Hello, everyone. Welcome to this fun adventure where we explore the English language. Today, I'm going to share a story about how English began. Have you ever thought about this? Why do so many people speak English? Where did this language come from? Well, let's start our journey. Chapter 1, The Beginning of English. A very long time ago, there were no words like hello or good morning. In fact, the English language did not exist. Thousands of years ago, people in different places spoke different languages. There were no books, no schools, and no internet. People used languages that were nothing like English. But slowly, things started to change. Let's go back to a place called England, about 2,000 years ago. At that time, the people who lived there did not speak English. They had an old language that was very hard to understand. There were many small groups of people called tribes. One of these tribes was the Celts. They lived in small villages, hunted animals for food, and made clothes from animal skins. Their language was very different from the English we speak today. Then something big happened. People from other lands arrived in England, bringing their own languages. The first group to come were the Romans. They came from a place we now call Italy. The Romans spoke Latin, not English. The Romans were strong and powerful. They built roads, houses, and big stone walls in England. For many years, Latin was the most important language in England, but it was still not English. After the Romans left, new people arrived from other lands. They came from places we now call Germany and Denmark. These people were called the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. They spoke languages that were a little similar to each other. Their words were different from Latin, and they did not speak like the Celts. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes were very important in the history of the English language. In fact, the name England comes from the word Angles. When the Angles and Saxons came to England, their way of speaking became the most common. People started using a language we now call Old English. But don't get confused. Old English was very different from the English we speak today. It was much harder to understand. For example, the word house was hus, and the word king was sening. Can you imagine speaking like that today? It would feel very strange. For many years, people in England spoke Old English. It was used by farmers, kings, and everyone in between. But that was not the end of the story. Over time, England changed again, and new groups of people arrived, bringing their own languages. One of the biggest changes happened when the Vikings came. The Vikings were strong warriors from Norway and Sweden. They sailed across the sea and arrived in England. When they came, they brought their own language called Old Norse. Old Norse and Old English mixed together, and many Viking words became part of English. Some words we use today, like sky, come from the Vikings. Isn't that interesting? But that was still not the end of the story. Later, another powerful group of people arrived. They were the Normans, and they came from France. Their leader was a man named William the Conqueror. In the year 1066, William and his army took control of England. When the Normans arrived, they brought their language, French. For many years, the kings and rich people in England spoke French, while most ordinary people still spoke Old English. As time passed, Old English and French started to mix. That is why many English words today come from French. For example, words like restaurant and ballet come from French. After many years, Old English changed a lot and became a new kind of English. This new language is called Middle English. One very famous book in Middle English is The Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. Middle English was still not the same as the English we use today, but it was a little easier to understand. In Middle English, many words were shorter and simpler than in Old English. Sentences were easier to read, and even more French words became part of English. Here is an example of Middle English. Wan that April with his shore sooty. This means, when April brings sweet showers. It is still hard to understand, but you can see that English was slowly changing. After a long time, people started speaking and writing in a way that was closer to modern English. This big change happened about 500 years ago, and people called this new way of speaking modern English. Even though it had this name, it was still not exactly the same as English today. One big reason English changed was because of a famous writer named William Shakespeare. Do you know about Shakespeare? He was one of the greatest writers ever. Shakespeare lived about 400 years ago and wrote many plays and poems. Shakespeare created many new words and phrases that we still use today. For example, words like lonely and hurry were first used by him. Imagine how different English would be if these words didn't exist. Now we have reached the English that people speak today. More than 1 billion people around the world use English. That is a huge number. But even now, English is still changing and growing. New words are added all the time, especially because of new inventions and technology. For example, words like internet and email were not around 100 years ago, but today we use them all the time. So, where did English come from? It came from many different languages. It started with the early people of England and later mixed with the languages of the Romans, Germans, Vikings, and French. Over a very long time, English has changed and developed into the language we speak now. In the next part, we will learn how English spread to different countries. Thank you for listening to this first part of the story. Stay with me to learn more fun facts about the history of English. Chapter 2. How English Spread Around the World. In the first part, we learned that English began in a small place called England. Now we will discover how English traveled to many different countries and became the worldwide language it is today. A long time ago, most people stayed close to home. They lived in small villages or towns and spoke only their own language. But about 500 years ago, things started to change. People in Europe began to explore the world. They built strong ships and sailed to places they had never seen before. This time in history is called the Age of Exploration. England was one of the countries that started exploring new lands. English sailors and explorers traveled to faraway places like Africa, Asia, and the Americas. They didn't just go to see new places. They went to trade goods, search for gold, and sometimes take control of new lands. One of the most important places where English explorers went was America. In 1607, a group of people from England sailed across the ocean to what we now call the United States. They built a small village in Virginia and named it Jamestown. These English settlers spoke English, of course, and they started a new life in America. This was the beginning of English in the New World. At first, only a small number of people in America spoke English. But as time passed, more and more people from England moved to America. They built towns and farms, and soon English became the main language in many parts of America. Today, the United States has more English speakers than any other country in the world. English also spread to Canada. Like the United States, Canada was once a place where only indigenous people lived. But in the 1600s, people from Europe started moving there. Some settlers came from France, while others came from England. That is why, even today, Canada has two main languages, English and French. The English settlers in Canada built towns and spoke English, just like in the United States. Today, most people in Canada speak English, but many still speak French, especially in a part of Canada called Quebec. Now let's travel to the other side of the world, to a place called Australia. Australia is a large island far away from England. The native people of Australia, called the Aboriginal people, did not speak English. They had their own languages. But in 1788, English settlers arrived in Australia. The British sent these settlers to Australia, and they brought the English language with them. The settlers made new towns and farms, just like in America. Soon, English became the main language in Australia. Today, almost everyone in Australia speaks English. But Australian English is a little different from the English spoken in America or Britain. Australians have their own special words and a unique way of talking. Now, let's travel to India, a country in Asia. India has a long and interesting history. For a very long time, people in India spoke their own languages, like Hindi, Bengali, and Tamil. But in the 1600s, English traders and explorers came to India. They wanted to buy and sell spices, silk, and other goods with Indian people. Today, English is also spoken in many Caribbean countries. But just like in Australia and Africa, the English spoken in the Caribbean is not the same as British or American English. People in the Caribbean have their own way of speaking and use different words. This is why English is such an exciting language. Everywhere you go, people say things in their own way. After a long time, the British Empire became smaller. Many countries became free and were no longer ruled by Britain. But even after the British left, English remained important. People continued using English in places like India, Nigeria, and Australia because it was needed for schools, businesses, and government. Today, English is spoken in more than 60 countries around the world. In some places like the United States, Britain, and Australia, English is the first language that most people speak. In other countries like India and Nigeria, English is one of the main languages spoken along with local languages. The role of the United States. Now, let's talk about the United States. After the British Empire, the United States became one of the strongest countries in the world. American movies, music, and TV shows are famous everywhere. Because of this, more and more people want to learn English. The United States also became a leader in technology, science, and business. Many people learn English so they can work with companies or study in American universities. English as a global language. Today, English is spoken all over the world. It is called a global language because people use it to talk to others from different countries. For example, if someone from China wants to talk to someone from Brazil, they might use English. English is used in business, science, and even on the internet. More people are learning English today than ever before. Many schools around the world teach English as a second language. That's why you are learning English today, so you can talk to people from different places. In this chapter, we learned how English spread around the world. From America to Australia, from India to Africa, English traveled to many places because of explorers, settlers, and the British Empire. Today, English is a global language that helps people connect across countries. In the next chapter, we will see how English has changed in modern times and what the future of English might look like. Chapter 3: How English Changed in Modern Times. English is not the same today as it was 100 years ago. In fact, English is always changing. Let's look at some big events from the past few hundred years that changed the English language. The printing press and books. One of the biggest changes in the English language happened in the 1400s. At that time, a man named Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press. Before this, people had to write books by hand. This took a long time and was very expensive. Only rich people could buy books. But after the printing press was invented, books became easier and cheaper to make. Now, more people could buy books and learn how to read. This was very important for the English language. The first English book ever printed was The Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. With more printed books, English started to become more standardized. This means that people started to agree on the correct way to write and spell English words. Before this, people in different parts of England spelled words in different ways. But with more books, people started using the same spellings. This helped English become the language we know today. The rise of education. Another big change that helped English grow was the rise of education. Hundreds of years ago, most people did not go to school. They learned how to work on farms or in shops, but they did not learn how to read or write. But in the 1800s, more schools started to open, and more children had the chance to learn. Students were taught how to read, write, and speak English in a more formal way. This helped people use English better and in a more standardized way. More people could now read newspapers, write letters, and enjoy books. Schools played a big role in making English a common language for everyone, no matter where they lived. The influence of science and technology. In the 1800s and 1900s, the world started to change very fast. New inventions like trains, cars, and electricity made life very different. Science and technology became very important, and English played a big part in this. Many new words were invented in English for scientific discoveries. For example, the word electricity was created during this time. Other words like engine, telephone, and radio also became part of the English language. As technology grew, so did the English vocabulary. People needed new words to talk about all the new things they were discovering and inventing. The Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was a time when machines and factories changed the way people worked and lived. This happened in the 1800s, and it began in England. The Industrial Revolution created new jobs and new ways of working. Many people moved to cities to work in factories, and the English language changed because of this. New words were created to talk about work, machines, and factories. For example, the word industry became extremely important in this time. English had to change to keep up with all the new things happening in the world. In the 1900s, the world went through two big wars, World War I and World War II. These wars changed many countries, including places where people spoke English, like the United Kingdom and the United States. During the wars, soldiers from different countries worked together and shared words from their languages. After the wars, English became even more important because the United States became one of the strongest countries in the world. American soldiers, movies, and music helped spread English to many more places. English became the language of international business, politics, and communication. The role of American English. In Chapter 2, we learned how English settlers came to America in the 1600s. Over time, the English spoken in America became a little different from the English spoken in the United Kingdom. This is why we have two types of English today, British English and American English. Some words in American English are different from British English. For example, in the United Kingdom, people say lift for the machine that takes people up and down in a building. In the United States, people say elevator. In the United Kingdom, people say flat to mean a place to live. In the United States, people say apartment. Even though there are some differences, British English and American English are still very similar. People from both countries can easily understand each other, even if they use different words sometimes. The rise of American media. One reason American English became so popular was because of American movies, music, and television. In the 1900s, Hollywood became the center of the movie industry. People all over the world watched American movies and heard American English being spoken. American music, especially pop music, also became very popular. Singers like Elvis Presley, Michael Jackson, and Beyoncé helped spread American English to many countries. English is the most common language used on the internet. Websites, social media, and online videos are often in English. Many people around the world use English to chat with friends, play online games, and share information. Because of the internet, English has become even more global. People in different countries use English to talk online. The internet has also created new English words like blog, selfie, and video. These words didn't exist before the internet, but now we use them every day. English in business and travel. English is the main language for business around the world. Companies from different countries use English to talk to each other. For example, a company in Japan might use English to talk to a company in Germany. This is because many people understand English. English is also important for travel. When people visit other countries, they often use English to talk to others. For example, if someone from China visits Italy, they might speak English to hotel workers or ask for help in English. Because English is a common language in airports, hotels, and famous tourist places. New words and slang in English. As the world changes, so does English. New English words are made all the time. People in different places speak English differently. For example, some people use slang words. Slang is informal language used in daily conversation. In the United States, people say cool to mean something is good. But in the United Kingdom, people say brilliant instead. This shows how words can be different in different places. English is always changing, and new words are added every year. The future of English. Now that we know how English has changed, let's think about the future. What will English be like in 100 years? Will people still speak English the same way we do now? We don't know for sure, but one thing is clear. English will continue to change in the future. New technology, new cultures, and new ways of talking will shape the language. Who knows? Maybe in the future people will speak English in a way we don't recognize. Chapter 4. Different kinds of English around the world. In the last chapter, we talked about how English has changed over time. Now, let's look at the different types of English spoken around the world. English is a global language, but people don't speak it the same way everywhere. Each country has its own special way of using English. Let's explore how English sounds in different places. British English versus American English. The two most famous types of English are British English and American English. These come from the United Kingdom and the United States. They are very similar, but there are some differences in words, spelling, and pronunciation. For example, in British English, people say boot for the back of a car, but in American English, people say trunk. In British English, a big vehicle is called a lorry, but in American English, it's called a truck. There are also spelling differences. In British English, words like color and favor have a U, but in American English, these words are spelled color and favor without the U. Even the way people say words is different. Some people think British English sounds more formal, while American English sounds more relaxed. But even inside these countries, people have different accents and ways of speaking. Australian English. Now, let's travel to Australia. Australian English is similar to British English because Australia was once a British colony. But Australian English has its own special way of speaking. One big difference is the accent. Australians talk quickly and their English sounds more relaxed. They shorten words to make them easier to say. For example, afternoon becomes arvo. Breakfast becomes brekkie. Friend is called mate. Barbecue is called barbie. Even though Australian English is different, people from Britain and America can still understand it easily. Canadian English. Now, let's visit Canada. Canadian English is a mix of British and American English. This is because Canada was once a British colony, but it is also next to the US. Canadians use some British spellings, like color with a U, but they also use American words, like elevator instead of lift. One interesting thing about Canadian English is the accent. Canadians say about in a way that sounds like a boot to other people. But just like in the US and UK, different parts of Canada have different accents. Indian English. Now, let's travel to India. India is one of the biggest countries where people speak English. English is used in government, schools, and business in India. But most people in India also speak their local languages, like Hindi, Bengali, or Tamil. Indian English has its own special way of speaking. People in India sometimes use English words differently from British or American English. For example, in India, people say propone to mean the opposite of postpone. If a meeting is moved to an earlier time, they say it has been proponed. Indian English also has a unique accent. People roll their R sounds and speak in a way that matches their local languages. Indian English has a rich mix of influences, which makes it sound special. African English. Now let's travel to Africa. Many people in Africa speak English because of British history. In countries like Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa, English is an official language. But just like in India, people in Africa also speak their local languages along with English. African English is very different in each country. For example, in Nigeria, people mix English with local languages like Yoruba or Igbo. This mix creates Nigerian Pidgin English, a simplified version of English. Instead of saying, "How are you?" logically, people might say, "How you day?" In South Africa, people speak South African English, which has special words. For example, South Africans use the word robot to mean traffic light. Other varieties of English. As you can see, English sounds different in many places around the world. Each country has its own way of speaking English. Even inside a country, people speak English differently. For example, in the United States, people in New York City speak differently from people in Texas or California. In the United Kingdom, people from London speak differently from people in Scotland or Wales. English is a flexible language. It changes depending on where people speak it. This is why English is such a rich and interesting language. People from different countries can speak English in their own way, and it still connects them to others around the world. English accents. One of the most interesting things about English is that people have different accents. An accent is the way someone says words. Even if two people speak the same language, they can have very different accents. For example, in the United States, a person from the South might say right with a long I sound. A person from the North might say it with a shorter sound. In the United Kingdom, there are many accents too. People from London sound very different from people in Northern England or Scotland. Accents are important because they show where a person is from. They can also tell us about a person's culture and history, English slang and casual words. In addition to different types of English, people in different countries also use different slang words. Slang is informal language that people use when talking casually. Slang changes quickly, and new words appear all the time. For example, in the United States, people say cool to mean something is good, but in the United Kingdom, they say brilliant, and in Australia, they say ace. Slang makes each type of English special and keeps the language fun and fresh. So, what's next? Chapter 5. How people learn English around the world. In this last chapter, we talked about the different types of English spoken in the world, like British and American English, as well as Singlish and Nigerian Pidgin. Now, let's see how people learn English and why it is so important. Why do people learn English? English is one of the most spoken languages in the world, but why do so many people want to learn it? One big reason is that English is an international language. It is used in business, politics, science, and technology. When people from different countries need to talk, they often use English. Many people also learn English because it helps them get good jobs. For example, someone who speaks English can work for a big company or travel to other countries for work. English is also used in many universities, so students who want to study in another country need to learn it. English is important in many jobs, like medicine, engineering, and tourism. That's why so many people around the world choose to learn English, even if it is not their first language. How do people learn English? People learn English in different ways, depending on where they live and what tools they have. In some countries, children start learning English in school when they are young. In other places, people learn English by taking classes or using the internet. Let's explore some of the ways people study English. In many countries, English is taught in schools as a second language. This means students learn English along with their first language. For example, in countries like India, Nigeria, and the Philippines, English is an important subject in school. Students learn how to read, write, and speak English. They use English books and take English tests. In some countries in Europe, like Sweden and the Netherlands, students begin learning English when they are young. By the time they finish school, many of them can speak English well. English is also found in movies, music, and video games, which help students practice English outside of school. In some countries, English may not be taught in schools or may not help students speak well. In these places, many people take private English lessons. These lessons can be at a language school or with a private teacher. For example, in Japan and South Korea, many students go to English schools after normal school. These schools help students improve their English skills, especially speaking and listening. Some people also take lessons with a teacher, either in person or online. Because of the internet, more people are learning English online. There are many websites, apps, and YouTube channels that help people learn English from anywhere in the world. People can watch videos, do exercises, and even talk to English speakers online. For example, many people use apps like Duolingo or Memories to practice English words and grammar. Others watch YouTube videos where teachers explain English in an easy way. Learning English online is popular because it's easy and often free. You can learn at your own speed and practice whenever you have time. One great way to learn English is by using it all around you. This means listening to it and speaking it as much as you can. People who live in English-speaking countries often learn English this way. For example, if someone moves to the United States, the United Kingdom, or Australia, they need to use English every day to talk to others. Even if you don't live in an English-speaking country, you can still try to use English a lot. You can watch English movies, listen to English music, and read books in English. This will help you get used to how English sounds and how people speak in real life. Learning a new language is not always easy, and English can be hard for some people. English has many rules, and sometimes the rules are not the same all the time. For example, we say goose for one and geese for more than one, but we say moose and moose for more than one moose. English spelling and pronunciation can be tricky too. Some words like knife and night have letters you don't say, which can confuse learners. Another problem is that English has many different ways of speaking. Someone might learn British English, but when they listen to American English, it sounds different. This can make it harder to understand all kinds of English. Even though learning English can be hard, there are many ways to make it easier. One good way is to practice as much as you can. The more someone listens to and speaks English, the easier it gets. It's also good to start by learning the most important parts of English first. For example, instead of trying to learn all the grammar rules at once, you can start by practicing the most common words and phrases. This will help you talk in simple situations, like ordering food at a restaurant or asking for directions. Watching English TV shows and movies with subtitles can also be a fun way to practice. You can hear how people speak English in real life and learn new words and phrases. The importance of confidence. One big challenge when learning English is confidence. Many people feel nervous or shy about speaking English because they are afraid of making mistakes. But making mistakes is a normal part of learning any language. The more you practice speaking English, the more confident you will feel. It's important to remember that even people who speak English as their first language make mistakes sometimes. What's most important is being able to talk to others and understand them. So, if you are learning English, don't be afraid to speak. The more you practice, the better you will get. English is also used as a lingua franca, which means it's a common language that people use to talk to each other when they don't speak the same language. For example, if someone from Japan wants to talk to someone from Brazil, they might use English, even though it's not their first language. This happens because many people around the world learn English to communicate with others. English is used as a common language in business, science, and travel. This is one reason why English is so important today. In the future, more people will need to learn English as the world becomes more connected. Technology will keep helping people learn English with apps, online courses, and virtual tutors. Soon, there may be even more tools, like virtual reality programs that let people practice English in a virtual world where everyone speaks English. English will stay a global language, and people will keep discovering new and fun ways to learn and use it. Whether in regular classes, online courses, or by living in an English-speaking place, there are many ways to learn English. No matter if you learn English in school with a tutor or on the internet, there are many ways to get better at it. We also talked about some difficulties in learning English and how to handle them. The best way to succeed is to practice often, believe in yourself, and stay positive. Thinking back on our journey. Now that we are at the end of our story, let's remember where we began. English started as a small language spoken by groups of people in England. Over time, it grew and changed, shaped by different cultures, people, and historical events. Now, millions of people across the world speak English in many different ways. I hope you had fun learning about how English started and how it became the worldwide language we use today. No matter where you live or how you speak English, you are part of this incredible journey.
Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe for more videos.